Hi, I'm very excited to tell you about Montreal and Quebec in general. I'm from Quebec City. I studied in Montreal. I came to the US in 1995, but I continued obviously going home every year, and I recently published a book on national identity in Quebec. Quebec is a very special society. It's very diverse, but it's also very proud of its French roots and the fact that people live in French there. It's a living society. This is not just some kind of ethnic residual identity. People go to school in French. They raise their families in French. They have hospitals, universities, etc. So most people don't know about that, but there's 7 million people living in Quebec, and 95% of them are French speakers. Montreal is the second largest Francophone city in the world after Paris. So you have 3 million people in that city, what we call in English here French Canadians, but Québécois, but also Anglophones and people from all over the world who speak both French and English. Large community of Haitians, large community also of North Africans and West Africans who are French speakers, which makes Montreal a very dynamic, multicultural, very colorful city. Montreal is also super interesting because it's a meeting of both North America and Europe. Old Montreal is a very European city, but it's outside of it, it's built on a Cartesian grid like New York. So it's as if you had Boston and New York together, but with people speaking French and dozens of other languages. The food is amazing. The music scene, the night scene is great. It has four universities, two English-speaking, two French-speaking, so lots of students. So it means we have also a Latin quarter, where really mostly with the main city library and two universities, and the city is very dynamic because of the influx of students from Quebec, the rest of Canada, and from all over the world. June is also the month of the jazz festival in Montreal, and you have there like tons of free shows and like world-class jazz artists coming. The Canadian dollar is very low right now, so that's good for Americans. Montreal is also super safe. Canada has more restrictive gun laws, which means you don't have to be afraid when you go out at night. The metro is super efficient, super fast, super clean. People are very helpful. Quebec City is just 3 hours away, 300 kilometers, so 2 hours and a half, 3 hours, depending on how you go. And this is really a small jewel. This is the only walled city in North America. It's still built around a center, so you have all the streets coming to an old town. So you really feel like you're on a different continent, actually. It's very quaint, it's very small, it's easy, you walk everywhere, you wouldn't have to take the bus even to go to museums and restaurants and hotels, etc. Quebec is, unlike Montreal, it's even more French, so it's less diverse because most people who immigrate tend to go to large cities. Quebec feels very intimate and very traditional that way. Most of the city is along the St. Lawrence River, so you have views all the time. Very easy, wonderful place to practice your French, because unless you're in the more touristy area, you won't hear people speaking English on the street. It's probably 95% French speakers in Quebec City. So in case you wonder, French in Quebec is different from Parisian French, just like French in Belgium or French in the south of France is different from Parisian French. We have a slightly or not so slight, different accent. Just like you hear that I don't sound like a Parisian French person speaking English. But that's the interesting thing about French. French language, spread throughout the world. So anywhere you go in the world that French is spoken, the accents and the vocabulary sometimes differ. So learning French in Canada is a really interesting way to learn and deepen your understanding of the French language and French culture. You learn how the language has evolved differently in different places in the world. Obviously, the way it's written is the same, and everything in Quebec is in French everywhere. The interesting thing is linguists say that French in Quebec, French actually became a unified language in Canada first because immigrants who left France, or the first settlers in Canada, left from different regions of France, and it coalesced, or it kind of crystallized in Canada first. And the difference in the accent that you hear between French speakers in France and French speakers in Quebec is that the language has kind of remained closer to the original. So, for example, some expressions that we keep using in Quebec are no longer used in France, but it was the King's French actually was spoken in Canada for still. So different ways of speaking are still remain in existence in Quebec, whereas they have been abandoned in French. So actually someone who already knows French pretty well will find it very interesting to kind of get to the colors, the different tones of what a living language is. In France, they're also losing their nasal sounds, un, on. In Quebec, we're not. So actually, even poets, when you read old poetry, old French poetry, a French person reading it now might lose the rhymes because they pronounce endings the same way, whereas in Quebec we see where it's supposed to rhyme. So these are little things that actually makes a trip to Quebec really worthwhile. So when you think of having like 6-7 million French speakers in the North American English-speaking sea, is pretty impressive to think about the resilience, what it meant for French Canadians to keep their language alive and to keep their culture alive, regardless of politics. So I would strongly encourage you to consider going to Quebec in June and continue on your journey of learning French and learning different ways of speaking French and the different ways also in which all French speakers around the world are similar and different.